I live part of my life in downtown Toronto, working at the University of Toronto, where I split my life between the Department of Political Science and the School of the Environment, kind of tackling from multiple angles these big questions of kind of how we think about our human relationship with the human world and the non-human world, that kind of bigger space than us, that we have these deep relationships with that are so very fraught. And so a lot of my work as a political scientist is in these questions of energy transitions, how we think about how we use energy, who bears the burdens of producing it, what it is that we use it for. And it was really out of that kind of questioning of these politics of who bears the burdens of work and how is it made and where is it coming from, what is it doing, that these questions of work itself started to kind of percolate in my thinking. You know, how do we think about work and these other things that come alongside it? How do we think about rest and idleness, the sort of questions of stepping back from the work that we do to really think about whose work we're concerned about, what kind of work we're thinking about. And so that's sort of the genesis of this book. And really the book itself, the essays, came first out of teaching that I was doing. So I taught a course at the School of the Environment to first-year students on this question of idleness and the environment. I really was watching my students grappling with this question of kind of what were they going to do when they graduated? What kind of work were they going to do in the world? And so many of them are motivated by concern about the environment and about the natural world around us, these social relationships of justice, how that intersects with kind of the planet itself and its systems. I was chatting in an early phase of writing about these ideas with a friend here in Atlin, Trevor, who you know now, Fiona McGlynn, who's an avid gardener. And we were talking about this idea of kind of going to see this deterioration, a sort of end of life, the end of utility, the end of productivity. And Fiona sort of responded aghast in some ways, sort of saying, you know, it's really where plants are doing their own work, right? That's a time of incredible generation for these plants as they're sowing life for the future. They're sort of putting these resources into something for next year, for the time ahead. And it really made me think about sort of how we interpret particular ways of talking about rest or regeneration or productivity, and how we might need to kind of twist our own view on that in order to encompass something bigger. So how do we think about going to seed as something really generative and future-oriented, where it's maybe not about human needs, but about the plant itself, or about some relationship between plants and humans. And there's beautiful writing. The writer Jess Hoosty writes a lot about cultural regeneration and Indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge systems on the BC coast. Wrote this beautiful piece about kind of winter being for regeneration in her family's garden, kind of learnings from her community and particularly from her grandparents about sort of what happens under the earth in these times that seem so quiet. And it really struck a chord as I thought about her writing and kind of what's happening when plants go to seed, these sort of times of real kind of regrowth and what seems like a pause that's actually so incredibly busy, and that dichotomy of work and idleness actually maybe needing to be reimagined a little bit at a scale that's not just about how we interact directly with the world. Sort of what we talk about frontline workers and the people who often are in these underpaid and overexploited forms of labor who maintained that kind of set of responsibilities during a time of incredible kind of crisis in the world. That sort of those stark inequalities of who has access to leisure time, who has the choice to step back, what is it that happens when these moments of crisis kind of unfold. But it maybe brought us into a conversation where this sort of question of, is this the way that we want things to be organized collectively is really the case? And what are some of the alternatives? What are some of the ways that that could change? And so I think any moment where we can kind of stop and reflect, you know, is this the world we want to be living in? Is this the world we want to be building? Becomes so important. The juxtaposition of different ways of living is so important to the themes that I tackle in the book. So this idea of work and idleness as not being entirely antonyms, right? We sort of think of them as very opposite from one another, but in some ways they exist in relationship to one another, alongside, in this sort of back and forth, and they're not always in opposition, and they're not always in direct relationship either. We can sort of think about elements of work and elements of idleness kind of side by side, and I think kind of living in a one-room cabin in a place where we're not the dominant force, our built environment here is very small compared to the kind of lives of others that are around us. And it's a place that really brings that into focus, that, you know, our work and the work of others, other beings, non-human beings, is very vivid and present in a way that's maybe kind of under the surface in more built environments. When I land in downtown Toronto in order to teach, you know, what we mostly see are the kind of constructions of the human world, concrete and cement and skyscrapers and vehicles, roads, and that's not the dominant force in a place like this. And I think sometimes remembering that there are so many other lives that we depend upon that happen outside of our own kind of selves and relationships becomes a kind of key moment of learning for thinking about what it is we're doing with our work, with human work. You know, what are we disrupting? What are we upholding? What kind of relationships do we have with this back and forth that becomes so stark here at the cabin?